Lieutenant General Arthur Percival was about to sign the most significant surrender in British history in Singapore. The city was meant to be super strong, but his 85,000 soldiers lost to only 35,000 Japanese troops. Just 2 months before, the Japanese had quickly taken over northern Malaya using their intelligent tactics and good training. They moved so fast that the British had to retreat like a first bicycle attack to Singapore. When the Japanese crossed the Johore Straits and captured the bulky Timor heights above Singapore, Percival had no choice but to surrender. So, how did the Japanese manage to beat a more significant force? Why wasn't Singapore as strong as everyone thought it was? Could the British have lasted longer? To understand all this, we need to know why Singapore was so important initially. While the British had been understanding Singapore for years, the Japanese were starting to view it with greater importance. Bogged down in China and losing access to US British and Dutch oil, the Japanese decided to capture the raw materials they needed in the Dutch East Indies, the southern resource areas. So, to rescue the southern resource area, Japan needed Singapore as a jumping-off point, and without the capture of Singapore, our further war aims would have been impossible. The capture of Singapore was just a part of a much larger Japanese offensive across East Asia and the Pacific. As Japanese aircraft carriers hit Pearl Harbor, land forces would simultaneously begin the capture of Thailand, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Guam, Wakaland, and of course British Malaya. To do that job, the Japanese supplied a force of around 60,000 men under the command of Lieutenant General Tomoki Yamashita. Yamashita had been offered 4 divisions for the job, but he decided 3 would be more than enough. Facing them were some 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops, including Australian, Indian, and Malay soldiers, under the command of Lieutenant General Arthur Percival. He had been protesting the lack of investment in Singapore for years, but British planners believed his force was strong enough to defend against any attack. 88,000 troops, at least on paper, sound like a formidable force, but in reality, they had yet to have much fighting experience. They certainly didn't have any knowledge of jungle warfare. In other respects, the Japanese, in fact, more than made up for what they lacked in their relative workforce. They had over 200 tanks, compared to a paltry 23 on the British and Commonwealth sides. The Japanese superiority continued in the air. They put up over 600 aircraft, including many state-of-the-art fighters and bombers. In contrast, the British had just 158, including considered unfit for service in Europe, like the Vickers and Wildebeest and the Brewster Buffalo, which were essentially obsolete. The British did have a few things in their favor. One was force jet comprised of the brand new battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse. They were supposed to be joined by an aircraft carrier, HMS Indomitable, but she had grounded near Jamaica and never made it to Malaya. Force jet was there to deter any attack, but it could be used to disrupt Japanese amphibious operations if they took place. On land, though the British had few fixed defenses, instead planners believed that greatest weapon was the Malayan jungle. In that vast green wilderness, a campaign may be fought. There is no country for blitzkrieg. A new fighting science must be devised for jungle warfare. The British relied on the perception that the Japanese would somehow come to grief in the jungle due to the lack of experience in jungle warfare. Forgotten, their understanding of it was not much better. A widespread racist stereotyping also informed these mistakes about the Japanese as being both physically and mentally inferior, and that superior British or British-led forces would easily repulse these Japanese. When the Japanese invaded on December 8, 1941, those conceptions quickly fell apart. Launching from bases in French Indochina, the Japanese landed at Kota-Baru in Malay and Pattani and Songkhla in Thailand. Percival favored a defense-in-depth approach, spreading his troops across the whole peninsula. The Japanese outnumbered the British at the landing grounds. They could quickly concentrate their forces and isolate individual British units, which were destroyed. Systematic Japanese attacks accompanied the early stages of the Japanese invasion of RAF airfields in the northern Malaya, which reduced the number of serviceable RAF aircraft there from 100 ton down to just 50 in a concise space of time. In addition to that, Japanese bombers also attacked Singapore itself very early on December 8. These utterly unexpected events severely shocked military and civilian morale in the city. But the British still had their trump card, force jet, dispatched to destroy further Japanese invasion convoys in the South China Sea. However, on return from their raid, force jet was spotted by Japanese submarines and spotted aircraft. Without air support, force jet came under relentless aerial attack from Japanese bombers and torpedo bombers, and both were sunk on December 10th. Meanwhile, on land, the Japanese advance was relentless. Japan now had complete control of the skies and could quickly move. They used their bicycle infantry and light tanks to outmaneuver the British at every turn, even through the trickiest jungle, forcing retreat after retreat. The outnumbered Japanese in just 55 days advanced over 400 miles, losing only 4,500 men compared to 25,000 British and Commonwealth casualties. So, the campaign in Malaya was one prolonged fighting retreat by British and Commonwealth forces down the entire peninsula. The chief strategist in the Malaya campaign, Colonel Masanobu Soji, ascribed what he called the phenomenal speed of the onslaught to the superior equipment and training of the Japanese infantry. In Soji's words, even the long-legged Englishman couldn't escape our troops on bicycles. Having lost the Malayan Peninsula, British forces now prepared for their final stand on the island of Singapore. On paper, they had a chance. Fresh from the UK, the newly arrived 18th Division brought Percival's fighting strength up to 70,000 men compared to 35,000 Japanese troops. But morale among the British was extremely low. So we have the sinking of the Prince of Wales and the repulse, the removal of the remaining RF aircraft to Sumatra, and then the relentless Japanese advance down the northern part of the Malayan Peninsula. So these catastrophic reverses had an extremely negative effect on British morale. On top of that, Singapore's lackluster defenses were now on full display. The coastal artillery was designed to repel a seaborne attack, so there were few high explosive shells. and the few existing northern defenses were well within the range of Japanese artillery and air forces. Percival's first move was to blow up the causeway linking the island to the mainland. In response, he expected the Japanese to make an amphibious landing in the northeast, positioning most of his forces there and spreading the remainder throughout the rest of the island. All the while, the pressure on him was building. Despite its popular designation as an impregnable fortress, most senior British military planners accepted that it could not be held if the Malayan mainland was lost. So, General Percival was, in effect, being told to defend the indefensible. His instruction from Churchill was to keep Singapore to the last man, in complete defiance of all military logic. This was primarily a political rather than a military strategic imperative. The defense of Singapore was, first and foremost, a matter of British prestige. After a 2-week fall in the fighting, the Japanese offensive finally took place on February 8th. It began with a massive artillery barrage on the northwest portion of the Allied line, held by the 8th Australian Division. This was followed up by an amphibious landing that same night. Once again, despite their numerical inferiority, the Japanese could concentrate their forces and outnumber the British defenders on the landing grounds, pushing them back. By February 12, he was forced to return to his final defensive perimeter around Singapore City. This retreat involved destroying critical infrastructure and ceding control of the Bukit Timah Heights, the location of the British supply depot, and the city's water supply. Without this, they couldn't last much longer. Diversionary attacks in the northeast kept Percival's attention there and allowed the Japanese to establish a beachhead. By the time he realized that was the main assault, it was too late. His mobile reserve was too small to storm the Japanese advance. At this point, just as British and Commonwealth forces were moving towards surrender, the Japanese were beginning to be seriously concerned about their ability to continue the battle for much longer. General Yamashita had outrun his supplies, and his ammunition was running low. Had the British and Commonwealth forces been in any position to mount an effective counterattack, the Japanese would probably have found themselves in trouble fairly quickly. On February 15th, Yamashita and Percival met face-to-face at the Fort Meadow factory to negotiate terms. Fearful that the British would discover his numerical inferiority, Yamashita banged his fist on the table. The surrender had to be unconditional. Percival agreed and signed the last capitulation in British history. Despite his mistakes, his superiors severely let down Percival, who had underfunded Singapore for years. Malaya had almost no defenses and quickly fell to the superior fighting skills of the Japanese. With Malaya gone, losing Singapore was effectively a matter of time. The island was not the fortress it was claimed to be. Despite Churchill's fight to the last man rhetoric, Percival had little choice but to surrender. It's important to note that civilians suffered just as much as soldiers did during the battle for Singapore. The city's infrastructure was thrown into chaos by the Japanese bombing, and there was vast pools of acrid smoke produced by the destruction of the oil storage installations in the harbor area. City resident Molly Riley recalled how she would wake up almost choking on the smoke at night. On one occasion, she remembered when some rain fell. Our house was covered with a black oil film. The fall of Singapore damaged Britain's global image, pushing Australia towards seeking US leadership. Japan gained resources, but faced setbacks as the US exerted military might. Singapore's loss marked the beginning of Britain's decline in global influence. For 85,000 captured British troops, the ordeal began, facing brutality in Changi and forced labor on the Burma-Thailand Railway. Civilians in Japanese-occupied Singapore endured food shortages, conscription, and Chinese suffered greatly due to racial prejudice, with millions killed. Thanks for exploring the 1942 Singapore surrender with me. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts. Your support keeps these stories alive. Stay curious. Thanks.